thanks very much, Tom, for my lovely introduction. That doesn't mean you're going to get an added pay scale or promotion, though, by the way, by saying nice things to me. I'm not too sure where to stand, actually. Am I okay here? Yeah. So I think, like Colin and Annette have alluded to, I've really missed coming to in-person conferences and was actually really excited about being here today. I think that kind of gap we've had has made, probably like you, me reflect upon what we get out of coming to conferences. I really enjoy coming to conferences. It gives me lots of energy, it gives me ideas, and I think most importantly, I get to meet lots of different people and make friends as well, which is really important. Actually, coming to this event today made me reflect upon the first conference that I ever went to, and it was actually in 2001. I can't believe it was that long ago. It was the American Educational Research Association conference in Seattle. I still have really, really fond memories of that conference. I was presenting a paper with David Kirk, so was slightly panicked about that, if I'm honest with you. He's a stickler for timings, and he also, those slide transitions, you just have to get them off to a T. So slightly stressed about that. Deborah Tannehill, a lovely friend and colleague of mine, happened at the time to be running the SIG and the event. For some reason managed to spill a whole jug of water over me just as I was about to present with David. So that kind of heightened my stress levels quite a lot, really. I was fortunate, or some would know, unfortunate, sharing with Al McPhail. And we roomed together and had lots of pancakes together at breakfast, and we've continued to do that over the years as well. Of course, during the conference, I got to meet people that I'd been reading in various journals and things like that. So it was just such a significant time in terms of realising what conferences can be. So I hope for those of you that are new today to the Invisible College and coming to be later on in the week, that you enjoy your experience and fondly, like me, reflect in 5 or 10 or even 20 years' time about being here and being with this lovely collective of people. So thank you, everybody, for being here and coming today. And hopefully I'll get to chat to lots of you today, or if you're going to be at the BERAS conference later on in the week as well. I know Annette's thanked Colin, but I'd specifically like to thank Colin and his colleagues for putting this event together and supporting the PES organising group as well today. This really has been a task and a half, especially over the kind of holiday period as well. So thank you very much for that, Colin. Is my time up now? So my presentation today is Everybody Does Matter in PE, including young disabled people. My lecture's premised on a number of key questions, and these are in part encapsulated through the reflective account of an undergraduate student. So let me share that with you now. So this is an undergraduate's reflective account, and it's called Meeting Mandy. As I entered the sports hall, I could see them all congregated in the far corner, a couple of them in wheelchairs, 3 with walking frames. There was a boy with a big long white stick, a girl that looked like she got no arms, and a few other students. I felt uncomfortable at the prospect of going over to them. The teacher caught my attention. Have you met Mandy yet? Come on, I'll introduce you. You're going to be supporting her for the next 8 weeks. As I walked over to the group, my mind was racing with so many questions. What am I going to do if she's in a wheelchair, or the one with no arms? How will she be able to do netball, hockey, or badminton? I feel like I'm out of my depth and won't be able to support Mandy in PE. I can't believe Mrs. Jones, the PE teacher, hasn't given me more information about Mandy's disability before I met her. With my lovely colleague, Maura Hyland, we often share this reflection with our undergraduate students before they undertake their first placement in a special school, where they're going to be working with young people with disabilities. Their reading of this account, probably like yours, usually leads to conversations about feeling very uncomfortable, panicking, and irritation with the PE teacher. Some of you may also recognise an emphasis on the young people's impairments and concern about how they're going to be able to take part in particular sports. Perhaps you'll also read this as a medical orientation towards disability. Oops. So the questions raised by meeting Mandy are, how can Mandy be included in PE? Mandy has valued insights that should be listened to. How could we go about researching to produce this knowledge, this kind of valuable knowledge? What theoretical resources can be utilised to help explain the experiences of Mandy? You'll notice that my questions are orientated towards Mandy rather than the undergraduate student. I purposely do this given that the nature of the research I've undertaken over the years has focused on young disabled people. Furthermore, whilst I recognise the need to celebrate diversity and difference, I today focus primarily on issues concerning disability. Everybody does matter in physical education, and this includes young people with disabilities. For those of you who know me, you'll perhaps be unsurprised with my focus. You'll think this is all rather predictable. You are, of course, right, but I make no apologies for doing this. So just going back to the reflective account of meeting Mandy, what my undergraduate students and you don't realise is that this is my reflection. I wrote this when I was an undergraduate, and yes, I was terrified, very uncomfortable at being around so many disabled students. I literally wanted to get out of the sports hall as soon as I walked in there. For me, there's been much journeying since I scribed these words. It's important, though, for my undergraduate students to hear about my vulnerabilities, and this often reassures them as they start to think more about the different kinds of young people that they're going to be working with, including young people with disabilities. So before I attend to these questions, though, I want to spend a few minutes sharing a little more of my journeying. Professor Les Back's wonderful book, Academic Diary, and if any of you have not read it yet, I really suggest that you do have a read of that. So in his text, Academic Diary, he points to our profession's preoccupation with self-presentation that embodies entrepreneurialism, being smart, and world-class braininess. I agree with Les that we all too often hide many of our other interests and activities outside of the academy. So now I want to spend a few minutes bringing some of my interests to your attention that also at the same time enable you to see why perhaps I'm thinking and paying attention to issues of disability within physical education, sport and society more generally. This is when the boxing thing might be a bit. So like many of you in the room today, I enjoyed doing PE and sport as a youngster. I was a really good all-rounder and probably frustrated at not being really, really good at one sport. For me, PE was a liberating, fulfilling and exhilarating experience. As a youngster, I had a very blinkered view for a long time and assumed that everybody had this kind of outlook. And as Tom's mentioned, in recent years, as a few of you know, a lot of you know now, I've become a boxer and I've enjoyed the challenges of learning a new activity later in life. And just to point out, and this is another game that we can participate in later, the top left-hand image that you can see there is of two very willing participants during a conference that came to a boxing club with me. And those two participants happen to be in the room today. So you might want to see if you can think about who those people possibly can be. Anyway, the point that I want to emphasise here is that even as a mature woman, in Bourdieu's terms, my economic, cultural and physical capital gives me access to and the opportunity to take part in sport. Something I know more broadly may not be available to everybody, particularly disabled people. Another point, and to coin Stendhal's term, I'm aware that I'm severely able-bodied. Like most of you, and let's be clear, the majority of physical education teachers and sport practitioners are not just able-bodied. The emphasis on severely able-bodied goes some way to recognising this privilege and the significant distance this may be from young disabled people, or indeed many other young people that we encounter in physical education. Another defining activity in my journey through life has been gaining a university education, an opportunity that seemed a very distant prospect for someone who left school with very limited qualifications, and at the age of 16 was told in very clear terms not to bother staying on school for further study. Fortunately, I benefited from a more open approach at a community college, and later was also able to access higher education at a pre-degree level. In my view, opening access to higher education for everybody must remain an important priority. And on the issue, it's important to acknowledge that internationally, disabled people continue to be underrepresented in higher education, whether that's underrepresentation in academic roles or also as undergraduate or postgraduate students. As you'll be aware, this is particularly pronounced in physical education, sports-related courses and programmes. And of course, this then has an impact on the workforce that could be found in physical education and sport. Another experience to highlight concerns my past and ongoing experiences of volunteering in sport. For example, as an undergraduate, I volunteered for a number of sports groups supporting people experiencing learning or intellectual disabilities. This experience became a defining time for me. It opened my mind about different kinds of people in society, particularly disabled people, and the importance of offering sport to everybody. In more recent years, my volunteering work at an orthobox has combined that not mentioned yet boxing interest with a charity that supports mixed ability, non-contact boxing. This group very much challenges the orthodox of traditional boxing clubs and has a much more open outlook about who can box. My involvement in this charity also keeps me really grounded in the daily challenges of running a community sports club or organisation for diverse participants. So doing sport, going to university and volunteering have all contributed to the commitment that I have to researching with and for young disabled people to find out more about their experiences of physical education and youth sport. So having given you this brief insight, I'd like now to return to the focus of my presentation today. And I first want to hone in on disability. And on this matter, Roger Slee poses these two questions. How do we come to know disability? And what do we know about disability? And he goes on to argue that the answer for most of us is likely to be from a distance and through the powerful discourses and ideological frameworks of others. So let me add some texture to Slee's questions, albeit it will be necessarily brief and incomplete. So historically, in many countries, disabled people have been marginalised. people with disabilities have been considered with fear, seen as a bad omen and segregated. The placement of disabled people in asylums and institutions was commonplace in the United Kingdom until the mid-1970s. The observation that I'm going to share with you next about a British segregated institution perhaps offers a glimpse of the expectations of disabled people in these institutions. To be admitted to one of these institutions is to enter a kind of limbo in which one has been written off as a member of society, but is not yet physically dead. In these terms, the task that society assigns, behaviourally though never verbally, to these institutions is to cater for the socially dead during the interval between social death and physical death. The message is clear here. Disabled people possess little value and have no meaningful purpose in life. These segregated institutions were essentially a holding ground before physical death. At other points in history, disabled people have also been paraded as human freaks at fairs and in the marketplaces of Europe, a spectacle for entertainment. Counter this with disabled people begging on the streets of our towns and cities, the only option when employment was often a very distant prospect. For many disabled people and activists, the symbolic act of handing cap is closely linked with the term handicapped, language that's been resisted in many quarters because of this association. And on the issue of education, in England and Wales, it's been just over 100 years since schooling was made compulsory for disabled people. Initially, much of this education focused on low-skilled work training, and this was in separate, sometimes residential schools. While separate special schools have been the orthodox, there's been a drive more recently towards including students with disabilities in mainstream or regular schools. And with this, impassioned debates about the merits or otherwise of retaining separate special education. So the picture I've painted here is predominantly orientated towards an English or UK orientation. And within Europe, more broadly, I do recognise, of course, that there are some similarities and differences as well. Within contemporary society, there have also continued to be developments that are now supporting the inclusion of people with disabilities. And when I'm feeling optimistic, I can see much ground is being covered, including shifts internationally in terms of anti-discrimination legislation, the de-institutionalisation of people with disabilities, and a move towards independent living. Inclusion within the community has also been much more significant, and this includes the inclusion of young disabled people in regular or mainstream schools, and of course associated policy developments. To a large extent, these changes have supported a shift in thinking in which disabled people are becoming increasingly recognised as legitimate members of society. We mustn't underestimate these positive developments over the past 50 years or so. I'm inclined, though, to feel a lot less optimistic when I read newspaper headlines like these. David Kirk's recent book alerts us to the challenges that precarity brings, and there's much evidence to suggest that markers of precarity are more pronounced for young disabled people and their families. COVID has added to this uncertainty, and this is something that I've written about with my colleagues Annette Stride and Scarlett Drury. For many disabled people, the enduring legacy of discrimination, inequality and otherness doesn't want to go away. So I've purposely spent some time considering how understandings of disability are configured within society. I've done this because we should remember this provides the backdrop for better understanding notions of disability in physical education and youth sport more broadly. Disability talk in wider society through family, friends, schooling and the media also seeps into physical education and community sport, and this continues the ebb and flow of meaning and values afforded to how disability is understood, or should I say often misunderstood. So what does this ebb and flow mean for the material realities of young disabled people in physical education? So what I'd like to invite you all to do now is to grab one of the pieces of paper. I'm really pleased that most people resisted this actually, so well done all of you. One of the pieces of paper that's in the middle of the table that you're surrounded. I'd like you to just read one of the accounts. So these accounts are from different young people with disabilities that have been involved, or I've been involved in research that has been undertaken over years. So this is what some young disabled people were telling me about their physical education experiences. So how do you feel when you read this account? Would you want to be this young person? What would you think if you were this young person's teacher or coach? I think you'll agree with me, these are very searching questions. I suspect some of your reactions may include being disappointed, concerned, and perhaps even feeling some discomfort that you're part of a profession that's continuing to contribute to these kinds of experiences. Now, individually, each of these experiences may be similar to other young people and may not be considered exclusionary. You might be thinking that you know other young people who've expressed these kinds of feelings as well. And clearly for these students, including those with disabilities, if they continue to be exposed to these kinds of experiences, it's easy to see how physical education can be an isolating and problematic place to occupy. I would argue that the accounts from the young people with disabilities that you've just read and other stories are important as they shed light on how these young people negotiate and embody their disabilities and how physical education contributes to the devaluing and misrecognition of disability. So at this juncture, it's important to acknowledge that inclusion of disabled people in physical education is not a new phenomenon. Indeed, it's been long recognised that we teach in a heterogeneous gym. Over 30 years ago, Hallison and Templin noted, Billy wants to be there, Mary doesn't. Susie is an exceptionally skilled athlete. Johnny has difficulty with any activity. Danny is back in school after 2 suspensions. Karen has a perfect attendance record. Pam is epileptic. Larry is learning disabled. And Dave has a congenital heart defect. And Hallison and Templin go on there. But the picture that they paint is a very diverse gym. It's a heterogeneous gym. I would argue that by considering the experiences of students like Mary, Joey, Pam, Larry and Dave, we become better equipped to support everybody in physical education, rather than just considering those that embody our bodily privileges. And for our students with disabilities, we should not be thinking of them as the problem, but rather scrutinising our values and expectations about disability. We should also be examining the structures, practices and mechanisms and the politics of physical education in order to better understand how and why disability is located in this way. It's this broader problematic of physical education that I'd like to turn to next. So I draw on the thinking of Bourdieu, who argues what is problematic is the fact that the established order is not problematic. With this in mind, I want to make problematic the established order by critiquing relations between physical education, disability, and notions of inclusion. In making problematic, I want to outline what I consider to be 3 enduring issues within physical education that are thwarting the possibilities of inclusion for disabled people into Hallison and Templin's heterogeneous gym. So first, physical education scholars have been reluctant to engage with disability discourses. Disability seems not to have had the appeal of equity issues like gender, ethnicity, social class, which seem to have, to some extent, been more readily researched by scholars. At times, disability has been situated within the all-encompassing etc. when issues of social justice and equity are discussed. There are, of course, a few within the field who've made inroads, and here I'm thinking of the work of Karen DePaul and Donna Goodwin, who've led the way, and more recently the work of Anthony Marr, Justin Hagel, Ergvig Standel and Leslie Sharp have been significant in adding a critical edge to the discussions about disability, physical education and inclusion. And given that we're here at John Moores today, it's also worth recognising the work of Thabo Huntley in the broader sphere of sports coaching. It's also worth mentioning research underpinned by sports science has focused on disability, and much of this work can be found in the subdiscipline of adaptive physical activity. Whilst research is considerably useful in this area, I would argue that it also remains partial, as it centralises the movement of different bodily parts rather than capturing the views of physical education and sporting experiences, or indeed the political imperatives that underpin policy or curricular agendas advocating inclusion. The issue here then becomes one of how we conceive of people we're researching and the extent to which this perpetuates or disrupts the kinds of historically derived understandings of disability that I briefly highlighted earlier. In recent years, a number of scholars have suggested that we should move beyond the idea of single issue research, and here I'm thinking of the work of Dawn Penny, and articulated the merits of adopting an intersectional lens. I would agree with these scholars that intersectionality offers the possibilities to explore fluid and diverse constructions of young people's identities. I also acknowledge, as Archer describes, that temporary boundaries need to be constructed around these identity markers. Intersectional scholars within PE, though, continues to set these temporary boundaries in a manner that omits disability. By focusing on the reluctance to engage with disability discourses, the issue that I'm seeking to highlight here concerns what knowledge is valued within physical education. As researchers, we continue to be influential in the production of knowledge, and this doesn't necessarily enable the accumulation about everybody in PE. Disabled people and their different bodies are important. Oops. The reluctance to engage with disability discourses can also be related to how we go about researching the production of knowledge. There are many taken for granted conventions to data collection that we adopt that also mean we effectively exclude some people with particular impairments. For example, a young person with a learning or intellectual disability who doesn't verbally communicate may be excluded from a research project where the preferred method of data collection is interviews. data collection strategies need to be adopted in ways that reflect the research participants' preferred communication needs. Whilst this way of thinking may seem like a logical approach to researching people with disabilities, it's one that's not necessarily being followed by many researchers. And in part, this limited outlook about how we go about researching has led one disability activist to describe researchers as parasite people. I see much potential in the turn towards participatory approaches to research. And indeed, some of you in the room here today are championing this. And I've written with Ela Enright, Annette Stride and Ruth Brazier about the potential and challenges that this brings. The reluctance to engage in physical education researchers to engage with disability discourses, I would argue, is symptomatic of the lack of imagination in seeking to make connections with wider theoretical and methodological debates around difference and social justice in physical education. There are opportunities to build alliances, so theoretical and methodological developments can be cultivated. Just like we've immersed ourselves in feminist thinking, critical race studies and queer theory, we need to consider critical disability studies as part of our arsenal of theoretical resources, and in combination develop nuanced understandings of young people within physical education and schooling more broadly. I've certainly cherished the conversations and writing projects with Anne Flintoff and Fiona Dowling. We stretched each other to think beyond our theoretical and methodological comfort zones. The second enduring issue within physical education that's limiting the possibilities of inclusion for disabled students concerns the ways in which naming inclusion is often viewed as a sufficient illustration that it's being worked towards. In fact, there's lots of talk about inclusion in staff rooms, in featured articles in professional journals, and new education, sport, or physical education policies. Inclusion is a term that increasingly slips off the tongue of practitioners, academics, and politicians. It's worth remembering, though, that there still remains much debate and discussion between practitioners and scholars about what constitutes inclusion and effective inclusive practice. According to Armstrong and Barton, inclusion is a flagship ideal that enables diversity to be celebrated in schools through the transformation of cultures and practices. More recently, SLEE concludes that inclusion has been ambushed. There has been no transformation. Within physical education and sport, inclusion is being conceptualised in a practical sense by using a range of models, and some of you will be familiar with Winnick's continuum, step, tree, the inclusion spectrum, and there'll be other models as well that you'll perhaps use with your students. Many of these are advocated through various continuing professional development opportunities offered to teachers and also sport coaches. At one level, these kinds of inclusion models provide physical education teachers with a clearer insight into how their practices can change in order to support more inclusive physical education experiences. Are these models, though, merely part of the ambush that SLEE alludes to? Here it could be argued that physical education has changed little, but a facade has been put in place that gives the impression of change. I found Armstrong and colleagues' questions particularly useful when contemplating the meaning and purpose of inclusion within physical education. They ask, what does it really mean to have a physical education system that is inclusive? Who has thought it to be in need of inclusion and why? And if physical education should be inclusive, then what practices is it contesting and what common values is it advocating? and by what criteria should its successes be judged? These questions would not be perhaps too unfamiliar to advocates of curriculum reform and recontextualisation, such as David Kirk, Richard Tinning and John Evans. Taking these kinds of questions seriously would prompt us to question the very essence of what we do and why we do it. In focusing my discussions on inclusion, I'd like to highlight one of the challenges we need to better respond to. Inclusion has its practical advocates who have developed the kinds of models that I mentioned earlier that many of us often use with our undergraduates. There are also those who have contributed to discussions by taking a more conceptual or theoretical outlook as well. The research practice impasse that we often see in other areas of physical education and sport pedagogy is very much evident when attention is paid to inclusion generally, or if we're thinking about inclusion in relation to disability. Now, I've been part of this impasse myself. Indeed, earlier that I've argued that at a conceptual level, the models that I've mentioned are merely adaptive in nature and essentially preserving the status quo. After all, they're just tweaking or making minor adjustments or amendments to activities or practices. Simultaneously, though, I've used in my own practice these kinds of models that I've critiqued. I've done this rather pragmatically, as I know these models will help our undergraduate students and other practitioners. In part, the challenge here is to support students and practitioners to feel enabled to work towards inclusion. These models are an important starting point, but we also need to stimulate our undergraduate students' capacity to engage with critical ideas that begin to unlock the deep-seated and ableist constructions found within PE and sport more broadly. Of course, as Bachman and colleagues have recently highlighted, there's then the challenge of transmitting these understandings into subsequent practice. I recognise this is not an insignificant task, though. Something that we also need to do in higher education is to move beyond the tactic of superficially or incidentally attending to inclusion ourselves. Sometimes I feel like inclusion, particularly in relation to people with disabilities, is considered as an added extra in our teaching and learning. Inclusion should be at the beating heart of everything we do with everybody in physical education. One strategy is to have more professional conversations about what we think inclusion means and how our courses and programmes are collectively supporting the vision towards inclusion. In my visiting professor role at the University of Worcester, we thought this through with 12 members of staff and collectively established 5 principles relating to sports courses and programmes. We consider these to be principles in progress, but by making them explicit, this is offering a touchstone for us to check and challenge the ways in which we're working or not working towards these inclusive principles, particularly in terms of our individual approaches and also the curriculum we're delivering to our undergraduate students. The third enduring issue within physical education that's limiting the possibilities for the inclusion of people with disabilities in physical education is the tensions that exist when disabled bodies are expected to conform to normative practices dominating physical education. Normative practices have been discussed extensively within physical education, particularly in relation to heteronormativity. More broadly, we continue to use as our reference point normative, able-bodied ideals. But let's reconsider this for a moment. Imagine we live in a rather different society than this one. We live in a community where everybody uses a wheelchair, so we're all wheelchair users. Walkers settle into our community. They're in the minority and, of course, have accidents all the time. For example, they bump their heads on the low door plinths. After all of our buildings are not more than 1.5 metres high. Why would they need to be? Because we're all using wheelchairs. In our community, physical education teachers find it more challenging to work towards the inclusion of these walking students. Teachers find it difficult because the walkers don't have the wheelchair manoeuvring abilities of most students. Their legs tend to get in the way when they're playing wheel ball, wheel cross and wheel shot. And the walking students complain when they're encouraged to wear those specially designed leg restraints. PE teachers try to make more adjustments to wheelchair physical education activities, but normative understandings of PE driven by our wheelchair community dominate practice. Sometimes PE teachers admit it's just easier to get the walkers to opt out of physical education. This is a condensed version of a narrative that I've crafted, which was inspired by a story called The Village, written in 1975 by Vic Filkenstein, an internationally renowned disabled activist and academic. For me, my story of us all living as wheelchair users and having what could be considered to be walkers with disabilities join our community raises key questions about what inclusion is, why there's a need for inclusion, and who it seeks to benefit. The kinds of questions that Armstrong and colleagues posed earlier. For social model advocates of disability, this story is also a powerful tool for illustrating how disability is socially constructed. The scenario invites us all to imagine beyond how we currently know ourselves, physical education, and our students. To make discussions more productive around normative practices and young people with disabilities, I would be inclined to reorientate the focus away from normative to the notion of ableism instead. I concur with Slee that we need to recognise, acknowledge and dismantle ableism in order to be in a better position to work more meaningfully towards inclusive physical education. In essence, ableism is a form of prejudice and discrimination in which able-bodied people are viewed as normal and superior to disabled people. Isn't it interesting that discourses of sexism, racism and ableism and heterosexism are evident in physical education and sport more broadly, but less is explicitly being said about ableism in PE. Brett Smith's work in physical activity nicely draws our attention to ableism when communicating physical activity messages. In terms of our field, ableism is etched into physical education in many ways. So I'm just going to take a little bit of water. So in terms of our field, ableism is etched into physical education in many ways. Think about the changing rooms that often have clothes pegs or hooks that are at the height that assumes everybody will be standing to hang their clothes up. Giving the instruction to run is excluding those who move in different ways. Assessment and progression, which includes particular physical competencies, is less meaningful and achievable for some young people with degenerative conditions. Similarly, using as a default able-bodied expectations around performance is more likely to position young disabled people as less able. It's not that I'm crying, it's just that I need to cough, I think. Excuse me. During lockdown, the daily live streaming of activity sessions, including PE with Joe, which I know some of you will be familiar with,
was premised on the assumption that the main recipients of these resources were likely to be able-bodied participants. Whilst PE with Joe was a saviour for some, it wasn't for many young people with disabilities. In my view, focusing specifically on ableism brings issues of disability more sharply into our frame of reference. Let's be clear, disability is a form of social oppression, and ableism helps us to call out the prejudice and discrimination experienced by disabled people. Much of the research that I've undertaken with young disabled people, I've seen how ableism impacts on their physical education experiences. And I want to illustrate this by thinking about the performative imperative that I mentioned earlier. That is, the valuing of particular physical capabilities and consequently the misrecognition of the abilities of young people with disabilities. So listen to James's story. It's called "My Walking Frame Makes Me Different in PE." With my walking frame, it makes PE different for me. I mean, it's the same in that I'm with my class, with my mates. I can do it all, just like any other subject we do. I'm with my friends and I get to do what they do. I would say I have more things to think about, you know. It's like I have to get more equipment. It's like I've got more equipment to think about. I'd say it makes me very skilled at an advanced level. I'll let you carry on reading that. Mr. Davies is the PE teacher, by the way. In this extract, James acknowledges that physical performance is important in physical education. James also perceives his ability in relation to skill to be superior to other students. After all, he's thinking through the additional considerations needed to move with a walking frame. As he describes, he's at an advanced level, possessing what he deems to be valued abilities in physical education. However, the valuing process doesn't seem to be extended to the physical education teacher. For James, symbolic power of normative, able-bodied skills and competencies form a significant marker of ableism operating in physical education. Acts of ableism may seem subtle and insignificant, but it's clear they are felt by young people like James. Having just outlined 3 enduring issues within physical education that are limiting the possibilities of inclusion for people with disabilities, in regards to reluctance to engage with disability discourses, the ambushing of inclusion, and ableism in action, I want to conclude by sharing my optimism and hope. I'm encouraged when I hear young people with disabilities talk in positive terms about their physical education or community sport experiences. I'm also encouraged when teachers tell me about the ways in which they're supporting young people with disabilities and how this has changed their outlook about who, what, and how we teach. I have much empathy for those undergraduates who, like me, were in panic mode before or during the first encounter with students with disabilities. And I'm always pleased when I can talk to them and hear what they've thought and felt and learned from their experience. I'm heartened when undergraduate students focus on inclusion, adaptive physical activity and disability for their dissertations or final year research projects. And when I hear from them 1 or 2 years later and they've become advocates of including disabled students themselves. Like many of you, I believe we need to nurture physical education teachers who are interested in the development of everybody in physical education. And this includes young people with disabilities. In my view, our undergraduate students need to be taken to places they're unfamiliar with, and these places need to become familiarly different bodies, different activities, familiarly different contexts, different approaches to teaching and learning, and so on. Our undergraduate students need to feel comfortable with the familiarity of difference in all its various guises. My research in recent years has drawn on intersectionality within physical education and sport more broadly. Intersectionality has much to offer. After all, it's not just recognising that disabled people are disabled, it's recognising that they have a gender, ethnicity, social class and sexuality that makes their experiences and our perceptions of their disability qualitatively different. Centralising disability is not the opposite of adopting an intersectional approach. It's choosing to focus on one aspect of difference that's been marginalised in physical education. At the beginning of this scholar lecture, I shared my vulnerabilities when meeting Mandy. I've journeyed much since then, and the politics of disability remain important within my work, whether that's in the academy or through the community sport organisations I support. I hope the journey that you've navigated with me today has heightened your awareness of why we should concern ourselves with disability. Everybody does matter in physical education, and that includes young people with disabilities. Thank you.
Thank you, Hayley. How long do you need to clear your voice?
Probably about 10 minutes.
Right, well, we've got 11 minutes. Thank you, Hayley, for that wonderful lecture. Has anyone got any questions, thoughts, comments that they would like to pose?
Yeah, thanks, Hayley. Really great presentation. My question relates to your undergraduate students. How much diversity is in your undergraduate student groups, and how does that relate to what you're talking about?
So there's little diversity there, which I suspect for many of us in the room that would be similar, and I think that's one of the challenges. There's a cycle going on there, isn't there? So some students, if we're talking about students with disabilities particularly, end up perhaps not wanting to engage in or on sports or physical education related courses. So then we don't see them coming through. However, I would say actually, and I'm speaking within probably more of a UK context, since the process of becoming a teacher in England and Wales has changed, there have been more openings. So sports coaching students, for example, can get jobs and work in schools now within physical education context. And I would see we're seeing marginally more of those students with disabilities taking the coaching route and then ending up working in schools. So there are lots of challenges and problems with the way that teacher education has evolved, but in some way I think that's opening doors for other kinds of people actually. And certainly at the University of Worcester and here at Liverpool John Moores, there is a tradition, or not a tradition, that there are more students with disabilities that are engaging in PE and sport related courses. At least back at Beckett we're pretty rubbish actually. What about at your institution?
Yeah, I can't think of anybody with disabilities in our cohorts, but maybe some of my colleagues can help me. Carving.
I haven't had that either.
So yeah, and I think that would make a huge difference. Yeah, that's off the top of my head. But
Yeah.
Thanks anyway.
Yeah, you can't be what you can't see, so that's the same I think. And in terms of positive role models, the more diverse people that we get to be physical education teachers, the better really, because then students will
more closely associated with those people.
Yeah.
Soundbite Central. Maura?
Yeah, I think obviously really interesting point that you just raised there. But I think one of the things perhaps they're thinking mostly is that although physical disabilities, we have more and more students with more learning disabilities in our undergraduate courses than ever. These key principles that Hayley talking about, will be applied to those as well. So perhaps that side is increasing in terms of our undergraduates.
And I think, Maura, the point that you're raising there is interesting because quite often we conflate disability to thinking about people with physical disabilities and those that use wheelchairs. I have to say, part of me didn't want to put the story in about us all being in the world of wheelchair users because I was conflating then the essence of what disability often is conceived as. So as an initial message, that story is important, but then that needs to be layered with an understanding that that there are lots of different people with different kinds of impairments within society. So I think that's a good point, Maura. Have you only asked a question because you got a shout out at the beginning of my presentation?
There's a question from that young chap at the back there.
Firstly, thank you very much, Kelly. It was fantastic.
I didn't know that you were late, Dave. Don't worry.
Actually, now, very cognitive, thought-provoking presentation, and I want to express vulnerability in my interventions over the years. The first remark there about the nurturing pieces interested in the pedagogy, because I actually think there's I've been at fault for tokenism sometimes. We want to develop these interventions through our national organisations in the UK, these book trusts, and things like that. And then designers and people within those spaces say, well, what about inclusion? And it is an afterthought, definitely. So we put a child in a wheelchair on there, and tokenism is right. You look back at some of those resources that were developed, people don't use STEP and those differentiation principles that Ken Black and Stevens use. But my question is really, well, what can we give our community of practitioners as ways of avoiding that really? What can we do when we go into curriculum design and inclusion and it becomes just a routine? So the first thing is, I think you mentioned it, Hayley, it is a significant task, but what can we do? How can we get that right at the forefront?
Yeah. So I'm going to contradict most of the things I've just said in the presentation now in the way that I'm going to answer your question, Dave, because I think the key to thinking about inclusion is to think about inclusion in a very holistic way. Often there's a default that when we think about inclusion that might make us think about students with disabilities, and I purposely set my presentation up like that today. I think for our undergraduate students, what we need to instill in them is this sense that inclusion is about everybody. So if we're thinking about the inclusion spectrum step, Winnick's model or tree, actually that's a tool that you can use in your practice all the time, and that's most definitely what I do. So at that very practical level, there's that sense that this isn't a model that's going to help you with students with disabilities. This is actually something that's going to help you just to become a better practitioner. It's going to help you to think more laterally about the kinds of things you do. And if we could, in higher education, just get all our students to think like that would be really significant, actually. So separate programs and separate activities that are around disability are positive, but they also are negative because it's instilling that sense that this is really different. Well, actually, when you're working with students with disabilities, it's about you being imaginative and having a go, and you're not working and then having another go. But those are things that we want our practitioners to be good at anyway. So the Worcester Way principles that I put on there, you might talk with your colleagues, and those principles may be quite different, but they were just the principles that came out of the conversations, and they are the things that we kind of track back to now. which are about imagination, developing confident practitioners, etc. So I think that's why it's important that programs or courses have those conversations around inclusion and don't necessarily always see it as being a separate paper or module or area of content. They should see that as something that's filtered through and within everything that we're doing in our programs. And then it's going to help all students.
Last question.
Last
Yeah,
question.
conscious of time.
Good one, definitely good one.
Traditionally, historical academic researchers tend to go into a specific setting, get what they need. And you mentioned in your presentation about this idea of the perception of parasite people in regards to researchers. From an intersectional perspective, how can we address that?
Oh, Ronnie, that's a nice ending question, isn't it? I think that's quite tricky. And when you're researching and you have at the forefront ideas around intersectionality, like I said, Archer talks about those boundaries. So boundaries are going to be there. I think the key for me is sometimes in research we might say, and I did this years ago, I want to research people with disabilities. So that's what my focus would be. Maybe sometimes we need to say we want to research with young people, and then within the context you discover the ways in which those young people reflect different kinds of intersectional identity markers. So maybe that's the approach that we take, but by doing that, it means that the research that you do might not be necessarily as focused on in the group that you thought you were researching. So have more of an open mind about your participants and then utilise intersectionality in relation to that rather than prescribing what it is you want to research from the outset. I've answered your question a little bit, but I think that's a bigger conversation that your question would kind of instill really.
Brilliant. So if you could all join me once again for thanking Hayley. Colin knows where we're going now. So
yeah, we've got at least two options. So the first option is upstairs, room 302. There's a little notice on the door. Lawrence Foweather. Lawrence, are you still here? Or has he gone up already? Set up. He's gone up. So Lawrence is waiting up there, and he's looking to develop a consensus statement around physical activity. But across the way here, just out this door and in the next door, we've got Shirley and Rachel and colleagues who are looking at a different curriculum. So you got two options. After those sessions, we will come back here just before lunch. I believe there's some awards to be given out and a medal as well, I think, at that stage. Okay, so make sure you're coming back here before the food. Don't get too tempted. Okay.
Is that all right, Tom?
absolutely brilliant. Colin, how do we stop this?
You look at people and think they're really bored. And then when you think, oh, everybody's sticking, I'm getting on a disability